Hello, I'm Reverend Dr. Susan Thistlethwaite, and I'm a professor of theology at Chicago Theological Seminary. I'm also a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress on the Faith and Progressive Policy team, and I write a weekly column for the Washington Post online on faith. And I'm very pleased to be joining you for this conversation.
Oh, yes, I am with you. I'm Gary Laderman, Director of Religion Dispatches and Chair of the Department of Religion at Emory University.
Hello, Gary.
Hey. Great to talk with you, Susan.
Thanks. Same here. Gary, I was, very interested in asking the question, what's next? What's going to happen with the next Terry Jones? Because this kind of religious extremism that we saw in the Gainesville pastor, Reverend Terry Jones, who has a tiny little church of 50 people, is able basically to hold the world hostage and put our troops at risk. The president responds, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, General Petraeus weighs in.
Yeah.
So I think that we have to assume that this is a model for others who want to garner attention, and in the age of the internet, that's not only possible, it is likely that this is a model. But I was thinking back to, this is not the first Koran burning by a Christian religious extremist, Fred Phelps, who is well known as a Christian radical. Actually burned a Koran a couple years ago, and it was brushed off by the media because it was regarded as so extreme and out of the mainstream. But now, when you have political figures such as Newt Gingrich or Sarah Palin or many others, and think tanks drumming up, and I will just be frank, I believe this is very strategically drumming up Islamophobia, I think that's a factor in the mainstream media now actually taking this kind of extremism with great seriousness. And I think it has tremendously negative potential, not only potential, it's currently being a very destructive development.
Yeah, incredible. Yeah, it's powder keg, absolutely. And I am just like everyone surprised at how pervasive the story became in the media and seemed to really just kind of fan the flames of hatred. And it is a very small community. But burning books is pretty extreme, and it's a big, scandalous story. And in the age of the internet, these things can just go viral, and everyone's commenting on them, and they become bigger in the media glare than maybe they would have been without it. So that people would see that this is a very extremist, as you say, group, and worth paying attention to, no doubt. But perhaps not being so much the focus of the media. I was thinking it's too bad that you don't get this kind of media attention with, say, the Dalai Lama visiting. Have people who would be writing about compassion, and it just doesn't obviously have the kind of, sadly, the kind of play as these kinds of very hateful acts do in our current culture.
Yeah, and hate is jazzy. Hate is attractive. We have very strong Christian theological concepts about that. We call it the demonic.
Sure.
So I think this really is terribly demonic. But I don't want to, and in my own thinking about this, I don't want to lose sight of how politically strategic this rise in well-orchestrated Islamophobic speech is in this particular time, because it is an election season. The Taliban yesterday were responsible for a riot in Kabul, about 800 people, a tremendous amount of violence. As far as I know, no one was killed, but there were people injured. But what's happening is that the Afghan elections are coming up. I mean, you can't really say that the Taliban has not learned something about electoral politics, because they are even in the absence of a Quran burning, using even the threat of that to inflame their followers, and it's the same kind of political energy that you see in things like Newt Gingrich's speech, for example, where he's talking about this is the communist threat. Islam is the communist threat, and any one of your Muslim neighbors could be a stealth jihadist, which is just like McCarthy and McCarthyism, which I've written about.
Right, and Newt Gingrich, for many, is considered an extremist, and yet he has plays a central role in the current Republican Party, and is a common and frequent commentator in the media. So, you think that media is partly to blame for allowing this kinds of extremist views to kind of so dominate the discourse and public culture?
Well, I don't particularly think that blaming the media is all that fruitful a direction to go, because I think as individuals and as people, we need to recognize that this kind of widespread digital age that we live in simply means that it's news going at gigabytes. Yes. And so I think that recognizing that's the environment that we're in, I'm really interested in, for example, things that Religion Dispatches does, or the Washington Post on faith. And I think more and more moderates, progressives need to get into this space and recognize that this is where the struggle is taking on. And I see this, if I'm using words like the demonic, I really believe that history is a struggle, and people of faith need to struggle to try to help as much peace and justice as they possibly can come to fruition. And I think this is where you need to engage the struggle. So even, this very conversation that we're having is part of what we need to do about it. I kind of believe
in the power of education as a form of social liberation, I suppose. And there isn't a lot of opportunity in the media for, more kind of thoughtful, sustained reflection on some of these things, or to open up a story like this one with the Quran burning, and maybe put it in as you were saying, and as I've written, in a more historical perspective, where you call it the demonic, but certainly religious violence in America is a prominent part of the American story.
Yes, the Rick Perlstein, who wrote that wonderful book, the historian, wrote the wonderful book Nixon Land. Actually, an excellent article last summer on the raucous town halls about healthcare reform, and he said, in America, crazy is a pre-existing condition, was the headline. And this, it's not new, so that's a good thing to put into the mix. But I think that many people are talking about the need to educate the American public simply about Islam. There's a shrill, even hysterical use of the word Sharia, whereas virtually, a very small percentage of Americans who are not Muslim have any idea what it is. And I was reviewing some of the Pew Forum on Religion polling from August of this year, and 55% of Americans say they know little about Islam, 25% say they know nothing. So you add those two statistics together, and what you have is a large knowledge vacuum. Yes. And I think the Islamophobes are working very, very hard to fill that vacuum with basically inaccurate, and I think for the safety, for our own national security, the using extremist language is in fact the very thing that will keep us less safe than, in a tolerant and open, free America, in terms of religion, in terms of speech, is it's Osama bin Laden's worst nightmare. That's not, what the extremists on the other side want to see. They want to see Americans at each other's throats. Yes. So,
well, and that's,
education is key.
And sadly, politics and the media, to a large extent, thrive on scandal, on sort of extremism, on trying to find a way to get your message out as simply and as quickly as possible. And it will be a challenge. It's not just a challenge for progressives, but certainly many others who really want some degree of sanity, especially around religion, will have to find strategies and ways that can counter what seems to be this more public tendency to just really want the sound bites and want the scandals and want the conflict.
And, it's possible to soundbite the other way, however. And, for example, there's the pastor, Reverend Larry Reimer, who so effectively at the United Church of Gainesville launched the, Read a Quran initiative, and through the help of a progressive media positioning organization, Faith in Public Life. And I should say, in the interest of full disclosure, I'm one of the people who helped found Faith in Public Life, and I'm currently on its board of trustees. And Faith in Public Life was designed to get moderates and progressives of faith into the media. So they worked with Reimer and his church, and all of a sudden you saw a counter narrative. And I actually talked to him on the phone, and he said that he was interviewed by Al Jazeera. So he was not just interviewed by CNN, he's interviewed by Al Jazeera. So here's an American pastor in a church in the same town telling the listeners of Al Jazeera, I'm reading the Quran from my pulpit all day long. And this is the powerful counter messaging that we need.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially just to keep in mind the context of the Quran, the supposed Quran burning, which was the anniversary of 9/11, and that obviously being a very fraught, loaded, powerful day that we're still struggling with in a lot of ways. And so, again, it's that sort of set of circumstances, I think, that leads to, really overdoing the coverage of someone like the person who wanted to burn the Quran and not cover the other person as much.
Yes, no, I agree. I totally agree. And I think that, we've got to be looking forward as we started talking about, because this crisis is far from over. I think it's really beginning to shape up as a fairly long-term struggle for American religious pluralism. And how do we understand freedom of religion, the protection for freedom of religion, and the protection for free speech, which also people abroad sometimes simply do not understand. Why don't you just go arrest this, the government arrest this pastor who would do this? Well, that's not the way we operate as Americans, and so that's difficult sometimes for people to understand.
And what do you think needs to be done in terms of the future? Obviously, there's been recently some news coverage of Supreme Court Justice Breyer's comments about all these things, and it seems the future, as it relates to what you've been talking about, is very much going to be kind of controlled by the Supreme Court. Would you say, or?
Well, I mean, the Supreme Court adjudicate things that come to them as cases. So I think that they will always have a significant role in how we interpret our Constitution. And that role, changes from court to court, because different courts have different understandings. But I think, leaving it to the Supreme Court is not exactly what I would recommend. And I think that it is very important for Christians to begin to realize that this kind of demonizing of another religion is just not Christian.
No.
And Jesus uses the parable of the Good Samaritan to teach the people of his time that a despised, ethnicity, a despised religious group are actually the people who can be more just than those who are the publicly righteous. The examples he uses of the Jewish religious leadership who walk on by. And so I think that, and it's not just talk. I think that I know a synagogue, a mosque, and a church on the north side of Chicago are working together to build, have been working together to build a Habitat for Humanity house. All right, that's the kind of on-the-ground, painstaking building of a working knowledge of our neighbors and beginning to understand how our neighbors are Muslim, our neighbors are Jewish, our neighbors are Catholic or Protestant, are people who have humanist convictions, and beginning to be proactive about the increasing American religious pluralism, which is not only a pluralism of religion, it's a pluralism of race, and all of these things connect.
Well, and I want, just going off on something you mentioned earlier, if you can use that model of pluralism, religious pluralism, sort of across the board for Christianity, and obviously talk about the incredible diversity within Christianity that exists around the world and around this country as well. You feel comfortable saying that these people aren't Christians who are proposing that they burn books and many others who are claim to be Christian but also claim to hate Islam and want? Well,
I think that throughout the history of Christianity, it is perfectly evident that not all Christians have agreed with me. And so I think that I have, kind of basically the same relationship to, let's say, the Christian militias in Michigan who were trying to plan to do violence against the police. I have the same relationship to their understanding of Christianity as the vast majority of Muslims around the world have to these, very small minority of Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda-related organizations that attempt to use Islam to justify the unjustifiable. People have always used their religious faith as a way to justify the unjustifiable, to give themselves a cloak of the sacred in order to perpetrate some of the most profane things that have ever, across the face of the earth, including genocide. So, but can you say that's not Christian? Well, it's my job as a Christian to make as compelling a case as I can for A, why that's wrong, and B, to both live out a different understanding of Christianity. It's exactly how I read the parable of the Good Samaritan. I've got to try to be a Good Samaritan. And I think that's some of the most effective teaching there is.
So I wonder how the more aggressive and hostile interpretations of the Gospels and the New Testament become, as you were saying earlier, a kind of means for political advancement, as a means to make people more fearful, and as a means to elect other like-minded people into office.
Yeah. Well, a project that I've been working on for a number of years now, for 25 years, I've worked on the paradigm of just peace. And just peace is a set of 10 practices that kind of parallel the 10 principles of just war, but these are practices that tend to promote peace. So we've now been working on an interfaith just peace project with approximately 10 Muslims, 10 Jews, and 10 Christians. And we're about finishing a book. And one of the most effective things we did in that project early on was and we had a meeting over a weekend, and each faith tradition brought its most problematic texts. So the Jewish community was talking about the texts that in Judaism are most used to justify violence. The Muslims were talking about the texts that are most used to justify violence, and so were the Christians. And this was so effective as a way to start our it's not dialogue in that sense, because dialogue and interfaith dialogue is normally everything we agree on. So then we carve out a tiny little space in the middle where we say, okay, this will be harmony, and we just won't talk about everything that's on the other side. And we reverse that dynamic. And it actually tremendously opened up the conversations, because then people talked, these are all people who are committed to peace and justice making. We're saying that then, here's how we deal with these in terms of context. Yeah. And when you interpret the Quran, you use this context in order to interpret, what the teachings are actually saying is the responsibility of a Muslim. And then the Jewish leaders did the same thing, and we as the Christian leaders did the same thing. So the book will reflect that let's not take the most problematic things about each of our religions and relegate those to the things we don't talk about, but in fact bring that right into the center of what needs to happen in interfaith work today. Sure. And that preliminary version of that has been published by the U.S. Institute of Peace, called Abrahamic Alternatives to War. It's actually available for free online. And then we're just about finished with the book-length project. But that's the kind of thing we need to be doing.
It sounds like it. And yet the media, I hope you get a lot of coverage, but the media won't, for some reason, that doesn't become, a sexy enough topic for public consumption, at least according to some in the media. And that's the challenge, as we were saying, in terms of how do you turn the corner on this and really find ways that the media can not just promote this, but become a tool or some kind of mechanism for greater possibilities to educate people about difference and the different religions that are, as you say, that are surrounding us.
Yeah, but yes, we talk about the negatives of the digital age and the age of the internet, where somebody can, have a cell phone and video someone burning a sacred book and have that become destructive. Right. But the media is not out there anymore. You're the media. I'm the media. Anybody with a cell phone is the media. That's YouTube. Broadcast yourself. Right. So each of us need to think in a different way about how do we get the kinds of media work every single person who has a cell phone can be part of, and how do we work with that medium and not continue to see it as something that somebody else does, because in truth, right here, right now, you and I, we're the media. And we're doing something else, and we just simply need to learn to do it better.
I think that's right. The media obviously is changing dramatically, and figuring out both, how we think about some of these issues today and dealing with the media, but also thinking about the future. And I think, as I see it in my classes, the younger generation has a different kind of interaction with the media, as you're calling it, an online life that may be encouraging for thinking about the future.
Sure, and I wrote an article about Twitter, and a lot of people thinking that Twitter is superficial, but haiku is not exactly superficial. So short and profound are not antithetical necessarily. So when you, there's of course a tremendous amount of garbage on Twitter. I really don't want to follow you through your entire day and know when you're at the food store and then when you're going on to the concert. But look at the way that young Iranians use Twitter to tweet up a protest movement, and how Americans have been able to be supportive, the American internet community. People going from being hackers and messing with folk software to hacking the Iranian security establishment and helping young Iranians do this. So here's Twitter as a direct social justice making form of media. Absolutely. So I think we've got to look at, yes, there's liabilities here, but also one of the liabilities is that we have to recognize its potential for peace and justice and work with the medium, not work against it and simply say, oh, it's all the media's fault, which I think is terribly simplistic, and it's the other guy's fault. Well, no, it's not, frankly.
Well, and it is about trying to transform from the inside, in a sense, from the ground up,
and that's exactly right.
And that's what's happened recently with media and sort of the online explosion.
No, I'm totally there, and you're right about the students. I also a professor, and really they are much more capable of seeing the potential of this medium to be able. I teach people who are preparing for ministry, and the way in which a number of my students have begun to write online, be able to use the media that are available to them, though I'm sure you have the same problem I do of making sure that people don't use their computers in class to start checking their email. And that I have threatened to turn off the wireless in the classroom if I notice people drifting away to surfing websites. But by and large, really looking to find ways that their expertise in online work is going to be part of how they change the narrative away from hate speech to the Good Samaritan.
And you're optimistic about the future in terms of the sort of generational shift that's taking place, and how the younger generation is really kind of recreating the online world and figuring out how best to use it for their own good, but also for social good.
Yes, I think that you look again at the recent Pew research and the breakdown in who doesn't know much or anything about Islam, and the highest statistics are people who are over 50. The millennial generation, those under 30, they know and are not all that disturbed by people wearing hijab on campus. There's a Muslim student group, no big deal.
Right.
And so they characteristically are far more comfortable, and they know more. And knowledge in this sense really is power for keeping our country from literally breaking apart and having the kind of religious conflict that I think the founders and the people who wrote the Constitution they were very uninterested in replicating the religious wars that they had, some of them even experienced, but certainly saw was characteristic of Europe. So we don't want that, and the Constitution has been a very good bulwark against that. I mean, see previous discussion of the Supreme Court justices. Freedom of religion, freedom of speech has tended to democratize religion. But it is it's a new day. So while I am optimistic, none of these things happen automatically in my view. That really we need to be proactive, we need to be intentional, we need to realize it's a soundbite world, and I do not regard soundbite as a pejorative. I think if you look at the haiku example, it's not that sometimes progressives or people in the mainstream are not being listened to by the media. They're actually just bad at it. And so don't blame the media, get better.
Well, I think just the way the younger generation is engaged and involved through the media, through online activities, that there does seem to be some hope for the future. And I think the younger generation are able to discriminate, in the soundbite world in ways that, well, I don't know about you, but that an older generation is not so well trained to do.
But we also want to think about how young people have so many stresses in their lives from the living in this digital age. And when I was in high school, if somebody passed a note about you in homeroom and said a nasty thing, that was terrible and it was very hurtful. But now, if you post it online, and everybody in the school, sees this, this is a huge sort of pressure for people. And you've had, cyberbullying is now an expression that I think parents need to be aware of. People need to know this medium is dangerous for young people. And I've been, 3 kids myself, my husband and I, and we are very careful in monitoring what young people do online because it's so powerful. Yeah. It can have a great, amount of power for good, but it can also have a really, really deleterious effect. And parents need to watch out and not trust their kids in any form of online communication. There are predators out there and all kinds of things that, just using this opportunity that we have to recognize that this is another aspect of parenting that needs to be monitored very, very closely. And we have flat
absolutely. And certainly the personal level and political level all needs to be attended to, and is very much a major, as you say, social force in our world today. Yeah. It certainly will also have an impact and transform religious life. I mean, it already is, I suppose, religious experience. How do you see that changing in terms of what you've been studying and thinking about, and the role of religion in the online world?
Well, I'll tell you that it was an interesting experience. Last week, I was so very disturbed by this rising Islamophobia and the attempt to basically rebrand the 9/11 anniversary, a day that had been devoted to service, to our fellow Americans, and to mourning the loss of thousands of innocent people. All of a sudden, people trying to rebrand this as an anti-Muslim day of action. I was deeply, deeply offended by that. So I got my colleague here at Chicago Theological Seminary to bring the video camera to chapel, and I preached a sermon about perfect love casts out fear. And I wrote the sermon specifically for an article on what to preach on 9/11. And for the very first time, I posted a sermon on YouTube. And there it was. And I was like, wow. And so it got a lot of hits. And pastors got a hold of me and said, could you send me the text? Because I'd actually like to use this sermon Sunday, because I've really been, confused about what I should preach the day after 9/11 this year, because people are really, angry and feeling upset. And so, I don't want to ignore it, but on the same token, I don't want to just be passive about it. So I got a lot of interest in it, and I realized that, here's another way in which I could be expanding teaching through YouTube. So, we live and learn, but I don't think if I hadn't been so offended by people taking the pain of these families, the 9/11 families, and trying to turn that into some kind of negative way to drive Americans apart from each other. I mean, I was truly deeply, deeply offended by that.
And you took the initiative, and you took the initiative and took a hold of the media, and as you said earlier, you made it work for you in ways that obviously were effective. Yeah. Very good.
Well, we can do more, and that's, one thing leads you to the next, and but I think that, a good thing about progressives, moderates, is that these are people who folk like to think about it, and so I think being somewhat resistant to a soundbite culture is there's probably more to the story than that. Well, I think that's true, but if you don't have a hook to get people to get into the story, then how is all the rest of that good thinking going to get out there? So I think getting better at this is, I think right now, I regard it as a kind of religious challenge.
Yeah, well, Good luck with it, and I hope we can have another chance to talk. I think our time is up, but I've enjoyed this.
Thank you. I actually, in the last minute, let me say that I have a new book coming out called Dreaming of Eden, American Religion and Politics in a Wired World. Comes out in October, and it talks about how the internet is changing both religion and politics. So perhaps concretely, we'll have an opportunity to talk in the future.
That sounds great and perfect.
Okay.
And thanks again, Susan.
Okay. All right. Appreciate it. Bye-bye.